Hello, everybody. Just as a quick sort of housekeeping note, if everyone could mute their mics, that would be amazing. And it would help this Zoom program go as smoothly as we can possibly make it. With that, my name is Joseph Harris, and I am the coordinator for the Center of Diversity and Inclusion here at DePauw University. First off, I want to thank the entire MLK Planning Committee for helping put this together, which included the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, the Hartman Center for Civic Engagement, the Unum Center for Sustainability, the Greencastle branch of the NAACP, and of course, Goldman Church. I'd also like to thank everyone for coming today. Our community here, our Greencastle community, our DePauw staff, faculty, and students, and anyone else who decided to join us today. Thank you, and welcome to this space. Today's theme is the arts and activism. And I'm really glad that nothing is happening in the world that makes that a relevant topic today. But we know that the arts have been intertwined with activism for as long as both have existed. The arts have been used to cajole, warn, to uplift, and rally. Scholars have looked to the graffiti in Rome to help them get a better understanding of linguistics, everyday life, and politics of the empire. The world's first warrior marching band blew trumpets and sang songs, and as the song says, brought down the walls of Jericho. We can look to the songs that were helped to use to guide slaves to freedom. We can look to the political cartoonists who are credited with bringing down the corrupt Tammany Hall political machine. We can look to the anti-war songs of the 60s peace movements, the urban art by Banksy that continues to tug at our conscience, or this prophetic admonition from famed poet Langston Hughes, who said in his poem, Warning, Negroes, sweet and docile, meek, humble and kind, beware the day they change their mind, wind in the cotton fields, gentle breeze, beware the hour it uproots trees. Or we can look to current artists like Zach De La Rocha or Public Enemy, who forced us to confront our modern selves. Or we can look to when art redeems and reclaims spaces and repurposes them, such as the image of John Lewis, the letters BLM superimposed on a statue of Robert E. Lee. The arts are a place of ideas, and the artists have used their talents to tug at the spirits of people since people had spirits. To that end, we can think of no better speaker for today's engagement than Scott Woods. Scott Woods is an Emmy Award-winning writer and event organizer in Columbus, Ohio. Woods is the author of Urban Contemporary History Month, We Over Here Now, and Prince and Little Weird Black Boy Gods. He has been featured multiple times in national press, including appearances on National Public Radio. He is the founder of Streetlight Guild, a performing arts nonprofit. He is the 2018 Columbus Foundation Spirit of Columbus Award recipient, as well as the Greater Columbus Arts Council winner of the 2017 Columbus Makes Art Excellence Award for his event series entitled Holla, 31 Days of Columbus Black Art, and he was named the first ever Face of Columbus by Columbus Alive. He is the co-founder of the Writers Block Poetry Night, and in 2006 became the first poet to ever complete a 24-hour solo poetry reading, a feat he has bested 7 more times without repeating a single poem. On a personal note, he is a towering intellect. He is also a writer for Medium, Level, and co-hosts an amazing podcast entitled Race Against the Machine. He is a good friend, colleague, and mentor. I am pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Scott Woods.
Well, thank you, Joseph and Chelsea, for getting this all together on my end. And Joseph, especially for those brilliant and kind words. We go very, very far back. So it is good to be in this space at his behest and to be here with all of you on such an auspicious day. As someone who barely finished high school and was expelled from a high school and a college, I never take these opportunities for granted. I don't see my path so much as an example of how much you can do with as little as possible. I see it as a bar that should be surpassed. So I'm really, really honored to be here. And I'm going to call my mother when this is all over. Something that I'll just kind of mention one or two things that the bio doesn't mention, mostly because they're more recent. Um, yes, I've published the 3 books, but I also write weekly for several news outlets. I write locally here in Columbus, Ohio for a press, Columbus Alive. And that's a column where they let me just basically do what I want. And then nationally, I write weekly, for Level, which is a Medium brand. And so I'm doing at least 1, sometimes 2 pieces for them a week. And those are on a variety of topics. But I get asked to do those things because of work like this, because of some of the ideas and things that I'll be sharing today and that kind of thing. So by request, I was asked, we should probably, I'm going to start with a poem, if that's okay. And I tried to think about, of the many really Black poems that I write, which is all of them. I tried to think of one that might fit today. And I have one. I don't usually perform this poem, but I think it fits on a day when we're kind of unpacking, kind of as a subtext to what we're talking about. We're kind of unpacking leadership and things of that nature. And so this is a piece entitled The Whipping Teeth. Every few years we need new ones. The old totems got a shelf life of one riot. When you tell someone with a phone and a gun in their pocket about boys like them yanked by a mob from a train, you've already lost. Everybody thinks they're the one who would have reached up and cut their own noose away. Spit back in a diner, white with hate heat. Pulled out deodorant when the fire hoses showered them with the hazing of scripture wrongs. Old shows are for old ways. Downloadable content, constant updates, memory refresh. You need high definition oppression now. Makes one long for the analog days of nightsticks. We are losing our religions too quickly now. We cannot keep up with our sacrifices, slipping into garbage can volcanoes. You'd think we were Mayan, the way we let our bodies fall in piles outside these projects, our hands reaching skyward, grasping at air, ringing the streets like picket fences. That's not fresh cut grass you're smelling. That's not a sunset so much as a warning. But then the Mayans sacrificed prisoners of war. Kings they cornered and made bow down. The old ways are probably still best as we are dethroned every day and cannot keep up with the prophecies. Yeah. So normally, if we were all in the same room, this is the part where you would be going wild because I just blew your minds with that dope poem. But I can feel your energy. So rest assured, I'm loving it. So today, I'm just going to jump right into a little bit of talk. So here's what today's going to look like. All right. I may sneak another poem in. We'll see what happens. But I'm going to do some talking. And then at the end of the talking, we'll have some time for Q&A. And I love Q&A. So I may talk a little less, but I'll say really powerful things that will probably generate powerful Q&A. Okay. So I'm going to try to leave a little more time for Q&A than we may have planned for. But we'll see what happens, right? It's all jazz to me. So today's theme is the current and future state of art and activism. Now, this is something that I am specifically poised to talk about as I am the owner of a nonprofit organization and an actual physical venue called Streetlight Guild. And Streetlight Guild is as I said, it's a building and a nonprofit, right? But basically, what I do is I do cultural programming, right? So I do art, I do music, I do um, all manner of things, right? There's an art gallery there. We have 2 floors of space. Um, that's been going on now for, oh, 2 years now. We've had the building for a year. We've had the nonprofit for 2. I'd been organizing for about 15 years before that. So there's a lot going on with me and Streetlight Guild in that respect. Um, and it's been a challenge, obviously, for the past year to do that work. It's very mission-based work. Uh, the mission of Streetlight Guild is to define and create and curate Columbus-based culture, right? So I'm trying to figure out and determine what it is my city has to say and offer and what it is through arts and other cultural things, right? Um, with an emphasis on underrepresented voices, right? So most of the musicians and the visual artists that I book are, for instance, statistically, most of them are women. Um, I would say about 20% of them, um, are queer in one way, shape, or form. Um, I occasionally I try to keep my white artists down to about 13%, right? So an inverse of the Black population in this country, right? I'm pretty good about that, keeping that. And so all of that is to create a space so that we can engage and learn and communicate back and forth with each other. That's my commitment to that, right? It's the kind of space that, as an artist, as someone who writes and has done other things as well, um, that if it had existed when I was kind of coming up and doing my thing, um, I would be 10 times the artist and person that I am now. And I think I'm pretty awesome, but 10 times me would be dope, right? So, and you need spaces to make those kinds of change, right? Dedicated spaces that are unapologetic um, about who they're trying to help, right? But I want to kind of start talking a little bit about kind of the macro of where things are in terms of art and activism, and then we can kind of break it down a little bit. Um, as far as art and activism goes, like kind of in this moment in time where things are, I want to warn you, I'm about to use a professional sports analogy, right? We are, as I believe in a society, we are in what I would refer to as a building year or a building era, right? It's that time when, maybe the football team or the baseball team doesn't have all of the elements that it needs to succeed. And so they take a year or season to recruit and to start thinking about, okay, who should we get? Who do we need to get? What resources do we need? To me, that's kind of where culture is, kind of across America, really. Um, I'm going to talk a lot about Black art for obvious reasons. But a lot of these things will transpose to other groups, right? So scale it as you see fit. And if you want to talk about it in some other directions, I'm certainly capable of doing that. But just know that I'm going to talk a lot about Black art. Um, so here's where things kind of sit in this building year, where we're trying to kind of figure out what we're doing with it. Like, art is not new in America. Clearly, that's not the problem. Um, but it has historically been very white. It has historically been very male. It has been historically very elitist. And that's kind of true across disciplines, right? That's kind of true for film. That's kind of true for music. That's kind of true for what ends up in museums and galleries and so on and so forth. And so, as far as where things kind of are, um, we're only now beginning to, in my opinion, we're only now, I would say in the last 50 years, beginning to grapple with breaking that up and getting to a reality, something that's more reflective of reality, something more representational, right? And in recent years, certainly in certain disciplines, representation has improved, if still statistically underwhelming, right? Um, Unfortunately, representation has started to become more important than actual agency, right? So we're not giving the power to determine things to the people that we are just merely representing. So we're developing something that kind of feels halfway there, but not all the way there, right? We live in what I like to call a for the culture time, where audiences and reviewers are willing to overlook maybe a project's lack of craftsmanship so long as it appears diverse. And that's its own problem, right? On the one hand, you want representation. On the other hand, you want it to, theoretically, you want it to be good, but at the same time, that's not necessarily a prerequisite. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. The problem with work that is merely representative and doesn't contain agency, does not empower the creator of it to do so with all the values and the culture that they bring with them to the table. The problem with that is that the work that gets created under this representation only banner generally doesn't last. It doesn't age well. History is not kind to such work in light of more exceptional work at the same time. So for instance, you know, while the film Antebellum is a for the culture win, it will get swept under the rug by history, standing next to stuff like If Beale Street Could Talk or One Night in Miami, right? When you don't care if the art is good, so long as it is representative, you make representation as useless a term as diversity, which I hope no one is particularly using anymore, right? It also allows for it to be weaponized against the very people it sought to represent. Arguably, we are entering a phase where creators of color, and this is where it's going to get tricky. Arguably, we're entering a phase where creators of color are allowed to make as much fluff as, say, their white counterparts, right? We're allowed to make bad films. We're allowed to make whatever kind of music we want. We're allowed to, you know, make cartoons if we don't want to make serious films, whatever. The problem is that business math doesn't add up. You know, these creators still have to create in an industry in which power is conferred, at least to people of color, based on financial success, less so ability. So it could be argued that it is in our interests to make work that stands out for its craft and ideas and doesn't settle for being black disposability, right? And yet, and yet, that's a long-term view of things, right? And it's a view forced to admit that maybe we aren't as free as we think we are yet. It is, in fact, an ancient debate, which probably shouldn't still be a debate at this point, considering we've been managing to do both things at the same time for the last 100 years, right? We've been making powerful, important, you know, work, and then we've been making things that are not powerful and important, right? Somehow we're still managing to do both of those things while we're having the argument about whether or not either of them will succeed, right? Which is kind of weird, right? We're not taking enough time to really sit down and look at that timeline. Anyhow, it is, in fact, the central argument at the heart of the story of the movie that just came out, One Night in Miami, right? Which path is the best path towards freedom? Is there really an argument when all of the paths work for some segment of the same people? When do we get to be as free as white people with our art? Now, here's the thing, and this is going to blow it back out to a larger point. None of this art, whether music, visual art, movies, whatever, none of it happens in a vacuum. Black Lives Matter is more relevant now than ever. People are literally still consistently being killed out here. The 2 killings by police in my city last month are instructive here. This past summer, we had protests like many other major cities. And during our protest here in Columbus, we had art, right? The people were commissioning murals and public works of art. And we didn't have, at that point, we didn't have a dead Black person in the headlines. We were protesting because it was the right thing to do. And while we were doing that, again, artists were being asked to paint murals. All of a sudden there's grant funding for this, for this very specific set of work. There's discussions about what to do with the work when things get better. And then December happened. And we had not 1, but 2 police shootings, fatal police shootings of completely innocent Black men, Casey Goodson Jr. and Andre Hill. Nobody's talking about murals now, right? There's no grant funding to address that reality. And so we're a community that's kind of reeling from having to, and bear in mind, this is not the first time we've dealt with this issue, but we're kind of reeling from having to face, once again, this reality about how things haven't changed and maybe how art didn't sell what we hoped it was selling. After all of the work that we did over the summer, what did that manifest in the winter? Not much. And so we're grappling with that. We're grappling with that. And people are grappling with that everywhere. Artists are grappling with that everywhere in every form. We think that representation is enough. And then something like that happens and you realize that's not the goal. That's not the end game, right? I want to talk a little bit. I know that got heavy. I want to talk a little bit about particular art forms in this moment. I won't dwell too much, but I'll mention a couple of things. Music in this time is largely what it has always been. Music has always been, a part of protest, and that largely isn't any different now. Film and television has become more interesting in this respect. It used to be whenever you saw like a Black film, like a white person still directed it, right? For many, many years. And now it is as if any Black film you see now can't be directed by a white person, which is fine by me. That's not the problem. I'm not stating that as a problem. It's just a statistic. It indicates that there's a shift in who gets to say what, right? So we're coming away from kind of random whoever gets to make whatever, which means white people get to make everything. And we're getting to this place where it's like, well, we tried diversity, right? We tried to diversify the roles, but the creators didn't change. And so now the creators are starting to change, and that's good. So now we're kind of getting to this place of representation. So there's this line that's happening, right? Um, and that's awesome. And when you and it's interesting because there's a political element to that work being present. What I mean is, movie companies are not particularly concerned with civil rights or human rights. They're businesses, they're industries, right? And so while it may feel like there's a ton of suddenly Black films and Black shows, and there are certainly more, it's important to remember that these are industries and businesses. White men still account for over 80% of film directors at the studio level. In 2019, only 35 out of, say, 165 studio films set to release in 2020 and 2021 are by directors of color. Less than 50 films will be directed by people of color in 2020 and 2021 combined. Right? Like, America releases like hundreds of movies a year. So while things look better and they've improved, I don't know where things go from improved to better, right? Because I don't think those two words are necessarily interchangeable, but that's the reality. On the writing front, like books and such, literature, uh, it's the statistics again are not vastly different, but the work itself has changed. Writing is always at the forefront of movements, right? We need people who can record what we are thinking and saying, and we need people to direct what we should be doing. And largely, those are writers of one stripe or another, right? When it comes to the arts and its participation in movements. But the change, Black writing has kind of exploded in recent years, but then the type of work also changed. Used to be like in like the 90s, you couldn't go into a Barnes and Nobles and find Black books until like Terry McMillan came out. And then all of a sudden, you could find some Black books. Like, Black books used to just have to be in Black bookstores, right? But in the 90s, Terry McMillan kind of changed all of that. And the Afrocentric movement changed some of that. And so when it became clear that there might be some kind of market for this art, they created African American book sections, right? But the work largely fell in like one of two categories. It was either Black women wrote all the fiction and Black men wrote something resembling critical theory, right? Maybe an autobiography, maybe. But that's not the kind of work that we're seeing now, right? I mean, we still see some of that work, of course. That's always work that will be there. But we're also seeing like the things when you see books that are being heralded by critics and on top lists for the year and on bestseller list, it's a different type of work. It's this creative nonfiction diving into the interior of Black lives mixed with critical theory, right? So it's not just historical movement theory and fiction. It's this whole interrogation, this public processing of the interior of Black life. I'm thinking here now of books like Heavy. I'm thinking of books like Thick. I'm thinking of books like Hunger, right? So we're talking Roxane Gay, Tressie Cottom, Kaiser Lehman. You know, these are kind of the type of book that's coming out now and has been for a few years now. And because they're blowing up, that's the kind of work you're going to be seeing for the next several years as well, which is refreshing, right? It's an angle of work that we have not encountered really before. even when we kind of saw glimpses of it in the past, say in James Baldwin's work, um, Letter to His Nephew, that kind of thing, you know, it still wasn't the like real, I mean, it at least it wasn't widespread as it is now. This deep, hardcore interrogation of Black life, this interior life, right? That Toni Morrison was essentially writing fictively about throughout her entire career, right? The suggestion that there is Black life worth interrogating, worth putting on the table, worth writing about without worrying about what white people think about it, without white gaze, right? That work is happening now, but in a nonfiction sense, in a creative nonfiction sense, and it's really leading the charge because it's dealing with real issues that Black people have always had to contend with, but now we get to do so kind of collectively, right? It's dealing with trauma. It's dealing with, you know, these taboo topics, sexual abuse, these kinds of things. That's a really powerful work that's happening, and writing is leading the charge there. I'll talk about one more category of art, visual art. Um, this one is interesting. You know, Black artists in the visual art realm. Well, we have to kind of talk about it in levels, right? There's the institutional level, then there's kind of like the independent gallery level, and then there's like the community level. And then there's like maybe a level under that that isn't aware of any of those levels, right? Black people have always obviously been a part of that at all those levels, right? But what's interesting now is institutions are now starting to be held accountable for their lack, you know, of corrective representation, right? Um, as we become, as you know, as technology has made us all more aware of each other and more aware of what each other thinks and more aware of what each other is capable of as people, as communities. We are now beginning in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, because that's when the technology really started to build up, right? Uh, like Facebook is like, I don't know, 12, 15 years old. Twitter is about 10, 15 years old. So as the technology has pushed us to become, whether we like it or not, um, an actual communicating town hall type society, we are looking at our institutions, we are looking at our organizations, we are looking at our universities, we are looking at our civic leaders, and we are looking at them very differently than we have in the past. And we are doing so more broadly. And where art is concerned, where visual art is concerned, people are looking to museums and galleries, and they're saying, where are the people who are not dead white men? Where's your money coming from? Who is sitting on your board? These are these really questions that museums are not used to answering, right? And once you kind of sprinkle a little bit of the pandemic on top of that, what you're dealing with then is all these places that can't even do their mission, right? Museums can't open, galleries can't open, they can't do art, right? Some of them are finding some creative ways around it, but no one would argue that it's not the same. And you know, their budgets are being enormously slashed. Museums are shutting down. Museums. So the pandemic has kind of thrown, you know, a pall over all of this, right? So the now isn't even the now that it was 2 years ago. The now is a very different now. The now changed, to put it, you know, succinctly. Anyhow, so to kind of wrap this portion up a little bit, I'm just going to say, you know, I would beg us to consider art in two ways, because it functions in both of these ways at the same time where activism is concerned. The first way is art as a voice or a balm for the oppressed, and art as absolution for the oppressor. Art as a balm or voice for the oppressed can be exhibited by things like protest songs or the development of independent art spaces, performance halls, clubs, and then actual forms themselves, right? The blues, right? And everything which stems from that, right? So that part we all get, you know. In fact, we generally talk about art as if that is all it is, when of course that's also not true. But it is, at least where the issue of activism is concerned, a balm and a voice for the oppressed. At the same time, art is often absolution for the oppressor. I'll give you an example that I've already mentioned. Last summer, here again in Columbus, but in many places, the city wasn't looking good. America wasn't looking good. People were protesting everywhere. People were protesting in places they had never protested before. On top of that, the pandemic was happening. And so the city couldn't just do some of the things that it might do in a normal situation like that in response, right? There were no festivals to distract. People were barely driving anywhere in April and May. So cities and organizations and cultural institutions, you know, they were all struggling throughout this entire pandemic. They've been struggling with relevancy, right? All of a sudden, people are trying to figure out how important is the museum? How important is this sports arena? How important is this, you know, whatever, right? Just all of this engagement. And so cities sought to create campaigns and initiatives, because cities have to run. They have to continue to make the sell as cities. They created campaigns and initiatives that were art-based, murals and that kind of thing. But faith without works is dead, right? So if you put a thing out there and you don't believe it, and you don't truly support it, or you don't truly understand it, or you want to just look good at while you're doing it, that is you attempting to absolve yourself as part of the problem. It's absolution for the oppressor, right? So in conclusion, in terms of the future, we didn't even talk about the future, but I'll try to blast that real quick. As far as art goes, there's going to be more of it. As far as activism goes, there's going to be more of it. That body of work is constantly being created. Now, the question will be how it gets accessed and implemented in people's lives and institutions. But that largely depends on how we come out of COVID. Now, I'm going to give you the bad news first. COVID cratered access to culture. And let's be clear, culture is not just art. Culture is fashion. Culture is ideas. Culture is language. Culture is cuisine. We don't have access to much of that in real time at all, right? Some more bad news. Places where you can access culture are dying, right? They're dying. The big ones, the little ones, the ones in between, they're dying. The longer that this persists, the fewer that you will see by the time things get back to some semblance of safety. You may end up like, you know, again, if art museums are closing, then symphonies are closing. And of course, galleries are closing. And of course, that really awesome club that you go to that had live jazz every week is closing. You know, we need to be watching what's happening to these institutions, these things that we thought were invincible. Um, but the good news is that art never dies, right? Art is water. It conforms to whatever medium and condition is at hand. So we won't have a problem with art. There will always be artists, but the issues of access and execution will remain. That's going to be our biggest hurdle. And that's still going to happen. Um, and I just want to speak this one more thing about execution. Execution includes criticism. Criticism is how we define canon, right? It's how we define what's important, what should last, what doesn't, whatever. So that canon, and during this time, this is a perfect time for us to begin to self-actualize that, to define new canons, right? Locally, regionally, nationally, into perpetuity, right? That's criticism, that's scholarship, that's communal discussion or experience. Um, we need to begin to start picking at what's there, what should be there, what isn't there, what could be there. I think I'll end on that note. I guess maybe we can do some Q&A because I'm pretty sure I said something to get somebody going.
Thank you very much, Scott. It was wonderful. We could post some Q&A in the chat. I think that'd probably be the easiest way to do it, because sometimes, you know, people would lag and different things like that. Sometimes everyone trying to ask questions over each other might be situationally hard to sort of organize. So Q&A in the Zoom group chat would be great. And while you all are thinking of it, I have two quick questions maybe we can start off with. And that'll give some people time to sort of gather their thoughts and ask some questions. But,
Please.
So the first part of the question is, it's just general advice to artists who want to create. That would be the first question. General advice, which I know is really broad, but just general advice to artists who want to create, how they can maybe sharpen their steel. The second part of the question is maybe a little more complicated, but it's something that you sort of touched on. And to use a sports metaphor, they say there's no way for an NFL quarterback to be able to prepare to be an NFL quarterback. That the complexity of NFL schemes are light years above college schemes. The speed of the game is ridiculously higher than it is at the other levels. And so QBs need to be given the space to be bad, right? And learn on the job. Like Troy Aikman went 1-15 his rookie year and went on to win 3 Super Bowls, but he needed that space to be bad. So, and the idea of like art, right? Especially for artists who traditionally have been outside of the canon, or artists who haven't had access, where is the line of demarcation where we allow artists who traditionally haven't had voices to have the room to be bad, versus what you were talking about earlier, when we're letting anyone sort of create and it's not maybe the best representation? Where's the sort of nuance in that?
So I'll answer your first question as succinctly as possible. The advice that I would give to any artist is to create. It's really that simple. You have to sit in the chair and you have to write the thing or paint the thing or play the music. And you have to do that until you are sick of yourself, right? You have to do that when people are asleep. You have to do that when no one is listening to you. And you have to do that constantly. You have to keep doing that. Only the work is the work. Talking about the work, thinking about the work, planning for the work, raising money for the work, none of that is the work. Only the work is the work. And if you want to do work that you can't do, then you need to find a way to do the work that you can do. Don't be one of these cats who's like, well, I don't have this piece of gear, so I guess I can't play this music. Don't be that cat. right? Don't be that cat. That's the first one.
You just want people to create harder.
Create harder.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. To your second question, that's a whole thing, right? But I think I have one answer. Let's be clear, there are no single answers to any of these questions. But one of the answers to your second is I cannot express enough the importance of space. There need to be places where this work can happen unapologetically, um, with mistake, um, with loving criticism, right? Uh, and where joy can be experienced in it. Like that space question is profound. That's why that is like the biggest thing that I could have done in the name of helping culture in my city was to just create a place for it to occur, right? And I needed it to have mission. Like I needed it to be a place where you could play the thing that you don't get to play in the other places, or you get to hang the artwork that you don't get to hang at the other galleries. As far as people who never had that access, I think it's also important for those spaces to have on ramps, right? It's important for you to be, open door, but with some degree of quality control. I have hardcore quality control elements in my space, right? Um, and I let people know, look, I'm the place, like if you want to do your first art show, cool. But understand it, that doesn't mean we get to do your first artwork, right? Um, I'm happy to put on you with your new band or the new formation of a band, or you want to try some different music than what you've been doing. My place is not enormous, so my overhead is not large. And so you can get away, we can both win if only 50 people show up to that show, right? So there's some scalability that's taken into account. And so anyhow, the point is, you can I create that space for you to do that, but I don't want your first song,
Right.
right? I'm not the place for beginners. I'm the place for people who are trying new things. That's a big difference.
I'm gonna read off some of these questions as they come in.
Please.
Jordan asked, pertaining to Absolution, as a Black artist, I don't want to write these quote unquote activist songs. It's always been a necessity. It's been processing, right? Where do you think the line is for opportunism?
Hmm. Well, first of all, nobody should be creating anything they don't want to. Let's just squash that right now. Um, Now, if that means that puts you in a position where maybe you're surrounded by people who are not into what you want to do, that's just what it costs to do that, to be free. I'm a big proponent of freedom when it comes to artists. I think that you will only create your great work when you feel free to do so. And so I think I don't think you can just overly concern. Maybe I don't understand the entirety of the question, but I don't think you can overly concern. And I don't want to be reductive here either, but I don't think you can. You have to not care a little bit. If that, I don't know if that helps, Jordan.
Um, yeah, what I'm saying is like these songs come out of like that creative, like these things are happening. I'm feeling this emotion. I have to put this down. You know what I
Gotcha.
mean? They come from that sort of place.
Okay.
And like being like as an activist or as someone who wants change in that way, like when something happens and being an artist, like you have that urge to like the way that you communicate that to the world. What if it's not talking, it's through your art, right? So it's not that you want to write about these sad things, these atrocities, these tragedies that are happening, but they're coming out of that necessity to get out that emotion, right?
Yeah.
But therein there's a in this moment, like this social media moment, there's opportunity to capitalize on that. You know what I'm saying?
Gotcha. I think so. Now I see your question. Okay. So listen, artists have to get over this notion that because their work is noble, that it changes its value, right? Like, it's okay for you to make money off of your protest music, right? Everybody loves, like, well, not everybody, but millions of people love Bob Dylan, right? Now we can debate, how protest is Bob Dylan, but I think you see my point. It's okay, not only for that music to come out and exist and be in its space and do its work. The question is it doing its work, right? If you're going to create art that is activist based, that is activist facing, that intends to help movements and that kind of thing, there's nothing wrong with selling that work or being paid to perform that work. Those are all completely reasonable expectations. And there are countless examples of people doing just that, right?
So we could get this next, we'll get some more questions in. Robert asked, early on, you said that representation could become as useless of a term as diversity. As you continued speaking, I began to gain some understanding of what you were saying by that, but I was wondering if you could explain how the term diversity has become useful.
Yeah, I knew that one was going to come up. So the reason why we don't talk about diversity anymore is because we understand that diversity doesn't mean anything is necessarily equitable, which is what we're really looking for, right? People who are underrepresented are looking for equity. They're looking for things like agency. They don't want to just be tokenized. And diversity, as it traditionally has been applied, is all that really allows for. It says, here is our 2 Black people in the office. Here is our 1 lesbian manager or whatever, right? But it doesn't consider equity. It doesn't consider agency. It's only a number. And that that's the case because nothing else about the space of the job or the work has changed. The problems persist. And it's because diversity is not empowering, right? And representation is slowly starting to become a very similar thing, right? Where I'll just use movies as an example, right? So now we see, just random Black people in movies that we would never have seen before doing random roles. That seems awesome, except for the part that it doesn't really change anything about how movies are made or written or how certain roles are portrayed. It doesn't really change anything. And so representation is kind of becoming the new diversity, which was the new tokenism.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Colleen asks, how can we confront the current understanding of what age-appropriate art looks like for the younger generation that shelters them from genuine Black stories on their screens, in their schools, and at home?
How can we confront the current understanding of what age-appropriate art looks like for the younger generation that shelters them from genuine Black stories? So I feel like this question has something behind it, right? Because for the life of me, I don't know why you can't just show a child something that you think that they can handle. Maybe I'm not getting the question down, but
Hi, I'm Colleen.
Hi.
So I actually run a program that's like an art-based education program for elementary school students. And a lot of the times when we show like Black art, I like looked to the internet and stuff for guidelines, and there's a lot of stuff saying like, you can show this art and tell this person's story in a way that is very like, this person was a abolitionist who advocated for the rights of enslaved people in the South. And then they just say, leave it at that. It's just a very, like an elementary level of background that is given. So I'm wondering how you as like an artist and someone who is, very much great, very better at this would be able to like have a conversation with children about how like actually there's way more to it than just the fact that they were an abolitionist. This art is revolutionary for this reason, more than just like an individual story. A lot of like the current elementary understanding is very like individual based rather than taking a wider lens. I hope that helps.
Okay, so I'm going to take another stab at your question now that we've had this conversation. And I'm going to tap into the librarian part of me, right? I've been working in public libraries for about 27 years. And so I don't believe that the piece of work, the book, the art, the song, the movie, whatever, I don't believe that whatever needs to connect that child or that group of children to the thing that I think that they should know, I don't believe that it doesn't exist. It just means I have to spend probably an inordinate amount of extra effort to find it. But I encourage, teachers who don't have that kind of time or resources necessarily, to definitely be constantly broadcasting that need, right? And not just once and not just in February, right? They need to be broadcasting that need on a regular basis to build, to kind of snowball that energy out into places where people who can create those things or have created those things or who are aware of those creations can access them. I'll give you an example. So every year, more or less, the last few years, I've created a children's picture book list that features Black characters, but I call it the list as long as the characters aren't on buses, boycotts, or playing basketball, right? That was like all children's books just did like those three, all Black children's books did like those three things. They were either on buses, playing basketball, or they were at boycotts. And I said, I just want a list of books with kids that like are collecting fireflies and building castles and doing, going trick-or-treating. And so I had to create that list. And so every year I put that list out, like 28 books, for February. And so there's a few of those floating. I got to do the new one for last year, actually, right now. And so when I made the first list like that, like all of these resources came pouring in after I'd done the list, mind you. But for the next time that I needed to do the list, I suddenly became aware of all these websites of all these independent Black writers and artists who were trying to make change in their industry. And so I guess I still don't know if I'm answering your question, but I would just say broadcast that need as widely and as frequently as you feel comfortable. Because I guarantee you, there's so much more out there than what you see. So, I mean, look behind me, right? Like there's so much more out there than you see.
Thank you so much.
We have two more questions. We're gonna end it after those two more questions. This will be the question from Adam will be the last one, and then I'll introduce Chelsea just to give a little instructions for the rest of the day. The second to last question is, I think that as an artist has always been the want for your work to be seen. How do we find a balance between creating work that portrays the authentic message we want and creating work that is liked and seen by enough people to make a stronger impact?
Always create the authentic work. Period.
think that's a good answer. I think we'll leave it there. And the last question is from Adam. He said, building off the last question, how can we use art in towns that are very homogenous to teach tolerance and understanding?
That's a tough one. This is almost like a space question, you know? I mean, this question assumes in part that we have some place to put such work. If you don't, then you're going to have to create that. Now, the interesting thing about that is that, you know, when I say something like that, people think, well, I don't have the money for a building, and I don't want to get an investor. I don't want to go in debt. Yeah, neither do I. And so for many years, I did art shows. I would put on art exhibits in other spaces because I didn't have a space. I would book bands in other people's spaces. I would put on poetry readings in other people's spaces. You have to be extremely creative about this, right? You have to be, like, to me, organizing is an art, right? Curating is an art. And so you have to be as creative as an artist when it comes to figuring out how to put that work out. Now, if you live, there may be an element to this question that is, what if I live somewhere where this art doesn't exist? Well, you know, the good news, at least right now, is that nobody can go anywhere, but everybody can be everywhere. And so you can bring your artists into your Zoom in your town, right? You can have that poetry reading here. You can have that musician play for your town in your, however you segment that event. You can do all of that right now. And I would encourage you to do it now, because once doors start opening up again, you ain't gonna be able to book nobody. Like, everybody's gonna be hot for about a year once the streets is clean.
All right. Hey, Scott Woods, I want to thank you for coming and talking and answering our questions. Before we go, I'll just give you a round of applause, a virtual applause. And I'm going to have Chelsea come in and just give us a rundown for the rest of the day. Once again, thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. This has been wonderful. What a great message for us to be thinking about as we're honoring Dr. King's legacy and thinking about art and activism. And I would encourage everybody, if you haven't already, throw up an emoji reaction for Scott to thank him for his time and sharing his thoughts and work with us. I am dropping 2 links in our chat. So for the rest of the day, we've got various things going on. So up next, there's a poetry boot camp with Scott. We have still got some spots for that if you want to hop in. If you go to depaw.edu/MLK, the links for the rest of the day are there, and I will fix the login issue so we don't have that problem moving forward. But at 1:30, Scott's going to do a poetry boot camp. I know some people on this call will also be there. So I encourage you to join us for that. And then we've got 2 virtual letter writing campaigns at 3 p.m. today. One focused on advocating for women who are incarcerated. The other will be working to condemn police brutality, writing to legislators in Indiana. So I encourage you to join those, get some context, keep learning, and then take some action on MLK Day. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Scott, for sharing your work and your time with us.
No, thank you.
Oh, I forgot to say, I put another link in there, depaw.turbovote.org. So you can't talk about Martin Luther King without talking about voting rights. If you are not registered to vote, you got to register to vote. Our next election, we've got primaries coming up in May for different people in different states. But yeah, definitely head there to register to vote. It's always important to use your voice in various ways. Now I'm done. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to end it.
Wait, Chelsea, what's the passcode to get in now?
Listen, Brian,
Bye, everybody.
Bye.